Hi, my name is Chris and this is Battle Nonsense. In this video we will take a very close look at the massive netcode changes in the Battlefield 4 community test environment, which DICE created in collaboration with Visceral. So, if you have played in the CTE during the last few days, then you will probably say that the hit registration feels a lot better now. But is that really the case, or is this just a placebo effect because you were told that it has been improved? So to find out, I spent the entire afternoon on Friday to test these netcode changes, and I want to show and tell you now what actually changed. So in one of my recent videos I showed you a netcode issue which causes that you hear and feel two impacts when you get hit by a single bullet, and that this is very confusing goes without saying. This issue has been fixed in the CTE, and so we have one very confusing issue less in the game. Another really nasty and big issue is the collecting of damage in Battlefield 4. I have done a video about this issue where I showed and explained it in detail, but the short version is this. When a player shoots and hits you 3 times, then these hits should reach your client one after the other exactly like the shots were fired. The collecting of damage issue causes that the damage of all 3 shots hits you at the same time, like one massive bullet. So you receive an impossible amount of damage in one frame. It is not only confusing when you take like 75 damage from a gun that is not even able to deal that amount of damage with one shot. This issue is also able to cause a one-frame death, and these are just infuriating because even though you might have died anyway, this collecting of damage issue makes your death feel wrong. You get the impression that you got killed by the netcode and not by a player. It also gives the impression that players might use damage hacks, which they actually don't. So this issue occurs a lot on the first few fired rounds of an automatic weapon, and players who have outbound packet loss are also able to trigger it. Now, I tried really hard to reproduce this issue in the CTE, and I couldn't. So, as I was the one who pretty much discovered this issue in the first place, I'm happy to say that based on what I've seen in the CTE, this issue appears to have been fixed completely, or at least is very rare now and hard to trigger. So 2 very nasty issues have been fixed by these changes in the CTE, and that should improve the gameplay quite significantly, because it removes a lot of the frustrating moments that we all suffered from. But how about the delays between players? These should also have decreased quite a lot according to the CTE changelog. So to find out if that's really the case, I had to get some reference values from the retail version of Battlefield 4, to which I could compare the test results of the CTE. And here I want to thank Vincent for letting me use his Battlefield 4 filming server, because usually I did these tests on an empty public server, which was just a very frustrating thing to do as random players always started to kill me or would just disrupt the testing in a different way. So thanks to him I could finish the test in the retail version in just 15 minutes instead of an hour. So if you want to find out what he's doing on his Battlefield 4 filming server, then have a look at his YouTube channel, the link is in the description. Now, on his server I made 2 tests. Both players had a ping of 15 milliseconds to the server. Each of these players has his own fiber internet connection, and they both run at 120 frames per second. I filmed this test with a camera at 60 frames per second. There is no packet loss, the packet queue is very low, network smoothing has been disabled, and they both use the 30 Hz update rate. The monitor on the left is player 1 and the monitor on the right is player 2. Player 2 will fire at player 1, and I measure the time it takes on the monitor of player 1 to show the firing animation, the damage indicator, and update the health value. I fired 15 shots and then calculated the average delays. So the results were these. 104 milliseconds after player 2 fired his shot, player 1 sees the firing animation on his screen. 116 milliseconds after player 2 fired his shot, player 1 sees the damage indicator, and 130 milliseconds after player 2 fired his shot, player 1 gets his health indicator updated. For the second test I increased the ping of player 2 by an additional 150 milliseconds, and then I repeated the same test, which got me these test results. So these are our reference values. Now the CTE requires special tests because of the changes that have been done in that patch. Unlike the retail version of Battlefield 4, where your client sends and receives updates 30 times per second, the rate at which the client sends updates to the server in the CTE has now been linked to your frame rate. This means that if you play with 30 frames per second, then your client sends 30 updates per second to the server for the bullets that you fired. If you play at 60 frames per second, then your client will send 60 updates per second and so on. Currently there is no limit in the CTE for how frequently updates get sent. Now, to be able to compare the CTE version of Battlefield 4 to the retail version, where updates are only sent 30 times per second, I had to limit the frame rate of player 2 in the CTE to 30 frames in my first test. Otherwise I couldn't find out if that increased send rate of more than 30 Hz actually changes something, and if the other netcode changes decrease the delays as the changelog claims. So I repeated the same test as before in the retail version of Battlefield 4. Both players have a ping of 15 milliseconds to the server. Player 1 runs at 120 frames per second, while player 2 has been limited to 30 frames per second. Now, the delays I measured are these. 120 milliseconds after player 2 fired his shot, player 1 sees the firing animation on his screen, which is a little bit more than in retail. 69 milliseconds after player 2 fired his shot, player 1 sees the damage indicator and the blood splatter, and this is significantly less than in retail. And with a delay of 73 milliseconds, the update of the health indicator also happens much quicker in the CTE. Now, what will happen if we increase the ping of player 2 again by 150 milliseconds? Then we get these delays, which show the same picture as before. A reduction of about 60 milliseconds for the damage indicator and the update of the health indicator. But why did these two get faster while the delay of the firing animation was increased by about 1 frame? The reason for this is that the developers implemented instant networking to tunnel the damage. Simply put, this means that the damage updates have been prioritized, and as a result of that they happen much faster. So while they managed to remove about 60 milliseconds from the damage updates, the information required to trigger the firing animation is still updated like before, and that's why we now have the firing animation play after the damage indicator and the update of the health indicator. Now you might think that this is easy to fix. They only need to link the damage indicator to the firing animation trigger of the player, and that's it. The idea is good, but it won't work, because when your client receives the update that contains the damage, then you only know that you have been hit, how much damage that hit inflicted, and from which direction the shot came. But your client does not know yet which player shot at him, because that information has a lower priority than damage. But these netcode changes are not the end of the line. The developers can still look into speeding up this information about who shot at you, so that all these 3 things happen at the same time and not have the firing animation delayed. But you might not even notice this delay, because what is really important is that the damage indicator, blood splatter and the update of the health indicator happen as fast as possible, as these are the most obvious ways to have the game tell you that you were hit. So when we look at the improvements that have been done here, then I have to say that this reduction of the delay by 60 milliseconds is quite massive, and you really feel it when you play the game in the community test environment. But how about that increased update rate when you play at more than 30 frames per second? How does this affect the delay? Now, before we take a look at the test results, there's something very important that you have to know, and that is that most people use the term tick rate wrong when they talk about the netcode. There are 2 different things that we have here. We have the update rates at which the server updates the clients, and the clients update the server. And then we have the simulation rate, or tick rate, which is the rate at which the game runs its calculations. You could think of it like the heartbeat of the game. What the developers now did in the CTE is that they linked your frame rate and the rate at which you send updates about your bullets to the server. So if you play with 30 frames per second, then you send 30 updates per second. And if you play at 60 frames per second, then it's 60 updates per second, and so on. There's currently no information why they linked this update rate to your frame rate, but my guess is that they do this because if the client already struggles to run at 30 frames per second, then they don't want to put extra stress on it by sending updates more frequently than 30 times. And if you can run the game at 60 frames per second, then it shouldn't be a problem to also send updates about your bullets at that rate. Now, at an update rate of 30 Hz, the client sends an update to the server every 33 milliseconds. And at 60 Hz, it's about every 16 milliseconds. This means that by doubling the send rate, we can reduce the delay for sending data to the server by about 16 milliseconds. This does not sound like much, but every millisecond counts in online games, especially in shooters. But there is a slight issue. The client and the server still have their simulation or tick rate set to a fixed 30 Hz. So how should increasing the send rate of the client help, as they don't create new data as fast as they can send it? First of all, this change is limited to sending data about your bullets, or the damage that they cause. So The idea is that once the client finished a calculation, then it has to wait for the next update to happen. At 30 Hz, this means that there's an update every 33 milliseconds. And this update rate and the simulation rate are not in sync, so it's possible that you have information like that you just hit someone, sit in your client and wait for that next update to happen. If you increase the rate at which data gets sent to the server, then your client does not have to wait that long anymore, so you should be able to reduce the delay by another 1 or 2 frames. But does this work? So I again repeated the same tests as before, but this time player 2 ran at 60 frames per second instead of 30. This decreased the delay of the firing animation by 20 milliseconds. The damage indicator gets updated 19 milliseconds faster, and the health indicator is updated 11 milliseconds faster. So if you play at 60 frames per second, then on average we have a reduction of about 1 frame. In some cases I even measured a reduction of the delay by 3 frames, but between 1 to 2 frames or 16 to 33 milliseconds appears to be the range of this change. So this does not look like much, but you have to put it into perspective with the other changes that have been done. This means that you reduce the delay by 10 milliseconds here, 20 milliseconds there, and when it all comes together then you reduce the delay by 60 to nearly 70 milliseconds compared to the retail version, and that's quite something. Then I set the frame rate of player 2 to 120 frames and repeated the tests, and here I noticed something strange. Compared to the 30 frames per second tests, the delay suddenly increased slightly. The firing animation was delayed by 9 milliseconds, the damage indicator by 20 milliseconds, and the health indicator by 24 milliseconds. I have already sent these results to the developer who is working on these changes, and now we have to wait and see what he can do about it. So when we look at these changes in the CTE, then the improvements are really massive. The double impact for a single shot has been fixed. The collecting of damage has been fixed. The damage indicator appears 60 milliseconds faster than in the retail version of Battlefield 4, and the health indicator is also updated 60 milliseconds faster. And if everyone would play at 60 frames per second, then this would remove another 20 milliseconds from the delay. So as I said before, these changes are not the end of the line. The developers are still working on improving them, as well as finding new ways to make the netcode faster, as well as fix issues that it and we are suffering from. One of the things that they want to look into next is increase the send rate of the server, which might remove another 1 or 2 frames from the delay. But in my opinion, the ultimate goal has to be to make both the simulation rate and the update rates a server-side config value like it is in the source engine. So that if you have a server that has, let's say, 32 instead of 64 slots, then it would automatically run at a higher rate. And if you want to have a 64-player server to run at a simulation rate of 60 Hz and use update rates of 120 Hz or something like that, then you can do that too. But you will have to pay a little extra to your game server provider, as your server will require more resources. So the game server provider will have to use a more powerful server or run less server instances on one physical box. If all of these changes or only some of them will be part of the spring patch is not clear, just like we don't know when we can expect this patch to be released. What we do know is that the increased update rate will come to PC, PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, as these are able to run the game with more than 30 frames per second. So if you keep an eye on my channel and Twitter account, then I will keep you updated on the progress of the spring patch, as well as the netcode changes that DICE and Visceral are working on together for Battlefield 4, Hardline and possibly also for Battlefront. If you enjoyed this video, then give it a like, subscribe for more, and I hope to see you next time. Until then, have a nice day and take care. My name is Chris and this was Battle Nonsense.